Hi everybody and welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave's epic linear Song of Ice and Fire reread. Today is a special episode for a few reasons. It's the 50th episode in the reread, which brings us to exactly the halfway point in the planned total series, which is kind of bonkers because I think we've been doing this for a couple of years already. It's also the Red Wedding episode, which stands linearly and I guess literally, I mean, in the sense of literature, in the sense of being a sort of central point in George's series, the Red Wedding is this giant marker. But I guess we can get
literarily.
Literarily, that's what I mean.
And I don't know if that's a word, but let's say that it is.
Exactly. And then it's also special because, as with the 400th VOK, which was the full castle recording of the Red Wedding, which I strongly recommend you guys give a listen to, we have some of the curators on to discuss the chapters this week. So we're going to be discussing events of the 14th to the 15th of December 299, Arya 10, Cat 7 and Arya 11 from A Storm of Swords. My name's Bina 007. I'm one of the curators on VOK, and joining me today are Michal.
Hi, I'm Inkasrain on the forums.
Katie.
Hi, this is Katie, Lady Griffin on the forums.
Adam.
This is Adam, also known as DrownedSnow.
And Nadia.
Hi everyone, this is Nadia.
And of course we have other curators, some of whom are on the FCR and feel they've already discussed the episodes already. I'll start that again. Okay, so with that, it just remains for me to give a spoiler warning for potentially all things published by George R. R. Martin, including preview chapters. We won't specifically be discussing Game of Thrones. I'm not sure if it is possible to spoil the Red Wedding anymore. It feels like it's ended into iconic social history. The first chapter is Arya 10. So at the end of the last episode, we left Cat arriving at the twins. That was Cat 6. It took place on December 14th, 299. In this episode, we start with Arya arriving at the twins on December 15th. The events of Cat 7 and Arya 11 all happen on the same day, and these are in fact consecutive chapters in the book. However, linear note, Ned left Winterfell on May 20th, 298. So it's been 1 year and 7 months since Arya last saw her mum and her brother. And I think it's Michal with the chapter reread.
Okay, let's get to this recap. The Hound and Arya make their way to the twins in a cart full of various byproducts of pig that they have foraged from a farmer. They are stopped on the way by a rude knight whose sigil is a black pitchfork on a golden bar sinister upon a russet field, and Arya, who has been determined to reveal herself to the first noble she sees, keeps silent in the face of the strange device. The knight turns out to be Sir Donald Haig, who is interested in not the apparent peasants and their pork, but in the Hound's horse Stranger. Clegane claims that Stranger is a wedding gift from Lady Went, and Haig allows them to pass with some rude words for the old lady. Clegane says that he clashed with Haig several times in tourneys, and Arya asks why the man didn't know him. Because knights are fools, and it would have been beneath him to look twice at some poxy peasant, Clegane tells her. Keep your eyes down and your tone respectful and say sir a lot, and most knights will never see you. They pay more mind to horses than to small folk. As they approach the twins, Arya observes that she feels more nervous than excited. She has had a terrible dream that she cannot now remember, but the fear it instilled has grown all day. Fear cuts deeper than swords, she reminds herself. There was nothing between her and her mother but a castle gate, a river, and an army. But it was Robb's army, so there was no real danger there, was there? Thanks, George. No danger at all. Arya is concerned about Roose Bolton recognizing her, but reasons that he will not, as she is wet, filthy, and the Hound has hacked off most of her hair. She thinks that Robb and Catelyn will not know her either. Arya, all of 9 years old, muses that she had been a little girl the last time she saw them, the day Lord Eddard Stark left Winterfell. The bedraggled travelers hear the music of the wedding before they see the castle. This recapper would like to note that the first musical device mentioned is a rattle of drums. They draw closer and behold the vast sprawl of the castle, the river, and the thousands of members of Robb's army spread across the field. The Green Fork is overflowing. The music gets louder, musicians in the camp playing disparate songs from those in the castle, so, quote, it sounded more like a battle than a song. Arya observes that the players are not very good, and is unnerved to see that the rain and darkness make it impossible for her to observe the banners around her. Arya and the Hound are stopped before the castle by a sergeant of Lord Bolton's, who is unimpressed by claims of food arriving for the feast. I guess to the man's credit, he is also unimpressed by knights. "The castle is closed," he said, "and the lordlings are not to be disturbed." The sergeant directs them to find a man named Sedgkins and unload by the feast tents. So the two travelers trundle off amidst the shining silk pavilions of the lords, as well as the dull felt and canvas for the common men. The drinking, Arya observes, had been going on for hours, it seemed. The music rose louder, but under that was a deeper, darker sound. The river, the swollen green fork, growling like a lion in its den. Arya searches the crowds as they pass, but sees not one familiar face or even a direwolf of Stark. She does see a man pissing, a young thin maester, a camp follower running out of a tent, and 4 archers who are slinging their longbows. The feast tents are packed to bursting with men, and Arya overhears a toast to the young wolf and Queen Jane, which confuses her. Sandor Clegane continues driving, and Arya suggests they stop, as she believes there are Northmen in the tents. The recapper observes that sadly she is right, because that's the whole point. Clegane says that her brother and mother are in the castle, and that Sedgkins can go bugger himself with a hot poker. After all, the hound says, he doesn't want Sedgkins. It is, and I quote, "your brother, your bloody brother, I want."
Nicely done.
Oh, this chapter is just like falling apart with foreshadowing.
I do enjoy that George, like, he makes this chapter do the extra legwork of building up the Red Wedding, just because, like, when I was reading this, my heart was pounding, and it's because I think there's that feeling that we've come so far with Arya, and she is so close to getting what she wants, but the feeling of dread is so portentous in the air that you know that something wrong is about to happen, and so you're not just worrying for her, it's the worry of what's going to happen to her, and also what's going to happen to Caitlin, and what's going to happen to Robb. It's just this perfect maelstrom of tension that it was really smart for him to actually put these two point of view chapters together into one place to make it more tense, dramatic.
It also, I mean, this chapter makes me, there's that famous thing that, like, his wife, Paris, made him promise not to hurt Arya or else she's going to divorce him or whatever. And I just keep thinking, like, what do you define as hurting? Because this is, we're on the edge of one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a person, much less a child, much less Arya after all of the things she's been through. Like, to me, this chapter is a really perfect, like, predicate to the Red Wedding itself, and also to the horror that is kind of the rest of Arya's storyline as we know it so far, because as far as she goes to this point, I don't think she would have become the, assassin that she gets to be if it hadn't been for this.
Yeah.
So close, this,
Yeah.
This sort of breaks her in a way.
So can I ask something though? So do you think it's the Red Wedding that forces her, Michal, to become more extreme and more emotionally damaged? Or is it the specific fact that she was so proximate to it, that she was so close before she was dragged away from her family? Is it something about having been at the gates of the Red Wedding that drives her over the edge?
I mean, I don't know if you can really parse the two, because I think maybe being so close is what encourages some of Arya's nihilism, or she's something of a nihilist. Like, she has a nihilist. I don't think you can be an assassin without being something of a nihilist. So I think that, like, we're all reading this as a story, and we think that as a story, this is coming together perfectly, right? Like, Arya, like, Robb is getting married. The last line of the chapter before this is, Edmure is getting married. We're resolving the story with the twins. The last line in the previous chapter is, like, we're going home. It's all coming together. Arya is almost there. And from her perspective too, she doesn't know all of the details of that story, but she is in it, and she sees that, she's kind of very much telling herself the story of this pending reunion, that she keeps thinking of her mother, and, like, if she doesn't get, like, she's supposed to get there. She knows she's supposed to get there. The Hound knows she's supposed to get there. After all of this, I think that in addition to their deaths, that proximity really, I think their deaths the Red Wedding itself would have destroyed a lot of her hope and her humanity, but the fact that she is so close, I think, and that story turns out to not only have kind of a horrible meaning, but almost no meaning. Like, there was no point in going to the twins. You just almost died, and everybody else almost died, and everybody else did die. Like,
there is a line, it's been a long time since I've actually read these books, but there's a line where Arya is concerned that Roose Bolton will tell her mother that she killed a man, and the fact that that is a preoccupation in her mind, that she's still this child that has slit a man's throat, but she's worried that her mommy will find out. Like, I found that line to be deeply nauseating, and I feel like that is also her last tether to any real sense of responsibility or shame about the act of murder, is the fact that, like, the people she loved might like she might get in trouble for it. And it's like once her mother is dead, her father is dead, Robb is dead, Jon and Sansa are beyond her reach. It just feels like, what does she have to lose by letting these darker impulses come out?
It's almost Nietzschean, isn't it? God is dead, everything is permitted. I mean, if everything that formed your sense of what is right and what is wrong, and the people who enforce that in your life, so your maesters and the structure and power and authority of Winterfell and parental authority, if all that is gone, well, does it really matter? You know, if you see injustice ingrained into everything that surrounds you, what is it? What does it mean for you to kill someone when everyone else is doing that and worse on a daily basis and no one is punished?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And she's also, the fact that she's with the Hound, who is kind of the ultimate nihilist in the series, certainly in philosophy, I think that has a lot to do with it as well. Like, she has a line, you know, he's like, oh, I'll finally be rid of you. And she's like, no, I'll be rid of you. And like, there is, you know, if she had made it and if the Red Wedding hadn't happened, you know, there's that possibility that she would have been able to shake this off. But he becomes her only... I mean, I think it's almost hard to, and this is something I know a lot of fans enjoy, and I do too, because it's fascinating, but like, it's hard to underestimate the impact that Sandor Clegane has on both of the Stark sisters, but in hugely disparate ways. And they both kind of hate him, but also learn a tremendous amount from him, and not in like, I think Sansa comes out better for it, because she has more balance in her life, but Arya is kind of in almost the Hound as a child's point of view, where she wants to be, she's kind of like him, you know, she wanted to be a fighter. You know, she has maybe not like the grand ideas of like pageantry and knighthood, but definitely that's an idea that's in her head, that knights are good and can help people. And that's been eroded to a certain point until now. But the fact that they continue after this, and that it is, you know, the whole structure of, like, that's the thing about the Red Wedding, right? Like, it breaks every single lie that all of the West, like, it exposes all of the lies that Westeros tells itself about everything.
And in fact, it's the most truthful act, isn't it? It's the most honest act. It shows the greed of the Lannisters, the greed of the Boltons, the Weasley dissimulation of the Freys. It shows that no matter how many battles he won, Robb was basically strategically poor. It's this stark, pardon the pun, central act that brings down the edifice of old Westeros and clears the ground for the chaos. And then hopefully the next book's the reconstruction of it. This pulls it all down.
Yeah, and Arya has a front row seat to that, and yeah, I mean, we don't get in these chapters as much, you know, her exact response, but from what I remember of them, it's pretty awful. I mean, George makes us wait like, you know, 55 chapters or something before we realize that Arya's not dead, but you know.
Yep.
This chapter was almost hopeful in a kind of way at the beginning of it anyway. When she rides into the camp, she's looking for signs of there being people from Winterfell and finding one of the banners or something, and she's looking up at the castle and trying to find something familiar, even though it's not Winterfell. And that's only because her mother and brother are there, and it's almost hopeful in a way, even though she can like sense that there's something wrong. And it's just so painful if you know what's about to happen.
Yeah, I almost wonder if like George even needed that part about her having a bad dream that she can't remember, you know, because you know, like it with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the music is just enough to get the point across that something's about
it sounded more like a battle than a song, and then you have the river growling like a lion in a cage, which is just like, I mean, I love that line. I think it's a brilliant line, but I don't think it was necessary to maybe compound that with. I mean, I guess he's a little subtle about it. Like, it's just like, she had a dream, it was awful, she doesn't remember it, but I kind of feel like he almost could have left that off as well. I wonder how much of this is, you know, there's kind of that apocryphal story that I think is true, that George wrote the Red Wedding last when he was writing A Storm of Swords. So I'm not sure how many chapters that comprised for him. Like, was this chapter included in that, or did he write like up until this chapter and then maybe leave this and the next one and the Arya chapter after?
I mean, not that I know anything about writing, but it feels to me like this is almost, I mean, it's clearly not one chapter, but it's an episode. And I feel that maybe if that were indeed the case, he was referring to it as an episode, because it's so intricately woven what he chooses to reveal, the shifting perspectives, the change in pace. You know, you have these two very short Arya chapters either side of this very long Catelyn chapter. That feels like it had to have been written as one. and even the story of it being done at the end, because the way in which he decreases the length of the chapters running up to this, and you get this sort of build up of tension, and he's dropping in. It feels to me like it had to have been written linearly. Oh, I had a question on this chapter. Does Arya really not know about Jane? Like, Robb married her back in August. Has she been in such a news vacuum? Because she's just been tramping around.
She hasn't been getting like the Daily King's Landing papers, so
she's not on Twitter.
Yeah, those ravens just fly right by her.
That was quite shocking to me, that even just in the mutterings of the small folk and, that Robb's in trouble, he's shagged that Westerling, that nothing had reached her ears. But
I don't know I wonder how much it spread, because it clearly spread to the phrase and there's dissent going on, but is that more of like a concern of like the nobles, and these people are traipsing around the Riverlands, they're not in cities, it's chaos, people are running for their lives, like it's possible maybe the small folk like haven't really heard about it much?
Well, it actually is kind of odd, because Arya actually does know that something happened. She just doesn't know what happened. There's that amazing irony where she's the princess that Frey is not going to get to marry. She's like, I hope your princess died. So I think it is a little bit weird also. If the Brotherhood was planning on ransoming her back to the Starks, then you would think that they would be a little bit more up on the news, but maybe they don't care. Like, they don't care who's in Robb's bed. They just kind of care where Robb is.
They live in caves. They don't know what's going on.
But that's their goal, right? Their goal is to take Arya to Robb and Catelyn and ransom her back, ultimately, right?
Yeah, that was the plan.
River Run would have been a good idea either way.
Yeah.
Just saying.
How far do you think Arya, at this stage, even when she's praying, like doing her nightly recitation of people she wants to kill, how far do you think she has a deep set, maybe subconscious liking for the Hound, recognizes that she relates to him? Or do you think that's nowhere near to be seen? I just feel that somehow, because there's this sort of like Arya and the Hound buddy road trip in the early seasons of the Game of Thrones, I project a much warmer relationship between the two than is actually the case.
I mean, they haven't actually been hanging out for that long at this point. So, she's just kind of come from him getting off of the trial and quote unquote, not killing Beric. And, she was so angry at him at that point. I think they do develop a rapport, and you can see the seeds of that here because they are similar. But I don't think either of them would, maybe if you got both of them drunk, like at the end of Storm of Swords, they would admit a certain camaraderie, but I don't think they would admit that at this point.
I think the Hound might not mind her so much, but Arya just has this going constantly in the back of her head that he killed Micah, and she just can't get past that. I don't think she'd ever consider him a companion.
Which I find bizarre in a certain extent, because she knew Micah for about a nanosecond, and she's seen so much injustice in the world. It's almost like this fixation. You killed Micah, and I love the Hound's response, which is basically, yeah, I did, and I do it again because I was following orders. And I don't know.
Yeah. Sometimes I forget about that, but it's like I forget technically they were princesses here, weren't they? Things move so quickly.
Well, Micah, I think George uses Micah in a similar way to, the way he uses the 4-year-old girl in Dance with Dany, who Drogon kills and eats, basically. That is Dany. That horror is Dany's link to something, like a line that can't be crossed. Like, she has to remember this. And Micah is the same for Arya, even though it comes from a much different kind of point of view, because Arya isn't conscious of keeping that tie to humanity. And at the end of Dance, Arya can't remember, Dany can't remember that girl's name, and obviously neither can I. At the end of Storm, Arya, I think she actually has a thought, like, who cared? Like, she knew him for a couple days. Why was she so upset about this? And I think that while that is an adult response, it is not one that Arya should be having, because she was close to him and his death was connected to her actions. Maybe it's a little bit like get over it, but at the same time, for Arya, getting over it represents something much more sinister than her preoccupation with it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this chapter, or shall we move on to the biggie?
Ooh.
Can I just say how very unpleasant these chapters were to read?
Yeah.
It was not fun.
I thought the Red Wedding one was going to be the worst one, but it turns out that Arya 11 is like the worst chapter.
Arya 11 is heartbreaking. Oh my goodness.
My stomach, I mean, I've read these chapters a lot, but every time my stomach just starts to knot up.
Can you tell that story, Katie? I love that story.
Oh God, I'll tell it after.
Okay.
Okay, let's do the
I
summary
mean,
for
I
Cat
have a very
7.
boring red wedding story because, like, my sister told me, and that was fine because I wanted to know. But
I
I
just
still
stopped
started the story.
reading. I read these before the TV show was on. I read The Red Wedding and I put the books down for about 6 weeks and I picked them up again. I didn't know if I wanted to be in the mind of this author who had done this thing. I didn't know if I had this is going to sound melodramatic, I just didn't know if I had the emotional fortitude to get through them, if this
No,
was the
I
kind of thing he was going to
totally.
do.
Yeah.
So,
That's
I mean,
fascinating because I know a lot of people have had that reaction of feeling betrayed almost by the brutality of the chapter. For me, I thought it was very exciting. I thought like that a writer was willing to do that. It propelled me forward even more than before. I guess I didn't have that innate revulsion. It was more excitement, like, oh, what's going to happen? Who's going to die next?
I didn't feel betrayed by him. I mean, and I think once Ned dies, you're kind of setting yourself up for this, aren't you? But so I admired him for doing it. I admired him for the bravery of it, and that it was so game changing in terms of the narrative and the politics of Westeros, and it was game changing in terms of fantasy literature. Again, God is dead, everything is permitted. Like the rules of the game have been thrown away. So I found almost like the literary implications more thrilling than even the plot of the book. But I still felt so devastated, and I just needed some time. I just needed to take a moment before proceeding. And I think it's also because I read these before I was involved in the internet fandom, so there was no one to sort of digest it with or talk through it with. It was just me
you couldn't
alone with this
decompress
experience.
anywhere.
Exactly. Like, what am I going to say? I'm reading these books and I'm really traumatized. I mean, I just had to get on with it. So, anyway, Katie, over to you.
I will say that just a quick thing, like that's why the story of George writing it last gives me a little bit of comfort. Like it did have some emotional resonance for him too, that he found it an emotional challenge to kill off these characters in such a brutal way. Because I think we all kind of think of George as this evil mastermind, and I do too. But it's nice to know that like he does get connected to characters too, even if he wants to slaughter them all.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The chapter opens with drumming. The rain pounds outside, but inside the twins it is hot and smoky and loud. Catelyn has been seated between Ryman Frey, who can't stop drinking, and Roose Bolton, who doesn't drink at all. The food is insultingly bad. Catelyn notes that Edmure is entranced by his new bride, but Roslyn's smile is a little too frozen, and it prompts Catelyn to remember her own wedding feast, where she spent the whole night pondering what kind of man Ned would be. The wine is flowing, and the Freys encourage their guests to get drunk, Great John Umber especially. We get a little tidbit from Fat Walda telling the story of how Lord Bolton chose her as his bride because she was fat, and a reminder that Lord Walder told Robb to keep Grey Wind locked outside during the feast. The wedding is so unpleasant that multiple people are stealing away from it, including Roose Bolton, who probably just ran off to use the privy, or go across the river to the Bastards Feast, or maybe to the camps. Catelyn thinks with relief that by this time tomorrow Robb will be riding off to another battle, and she wonders how many men here tonight will be dead before the year is done. Too many, I fear, she thinks. Lord Walder stops the music and announces that it is time for the betting. Roslyn is terrified and crying. It's generally horrible, as all bettings are in this series. Most of the hall clears out, but Robb stays, as do a few who are too drunk to leave. Daisy Mormont asks Edwin Frey to dance, and his violent refusal makes Catelyn go cold. Catelyn runs after Edwin, grabs his arm, and feels the chainmail beneath his sleeve. All the ominous portents of the evening fall into place, and the slaughter begins. Half the musicians take up crossbows. Robb is shot 3 times, and as Catelyn runs to him, she is shot in the back and falls. The Small John upends a table trying to protect Robb, but is shot and eventually beheaded. Robin Flint is encircled by Freys and stabbed over and over with daggers. Wendell Manderley is shot through the mouth with a quarrel. Sir Hostine Frey cuts down Lucas Blackwood. Donald Locke and Owen Norrie are both killed, and Daisy Mormont is slain with an axe to the stomach. When the doors to the hall fling open and Ryman Frey returns in full mail, Frey men at arms with long axes in tow, including traitorous Northmen. All the while, Lord Walder watches the carnage in satisfaction. Catelyn grabs a dagger off the floor and takes Jingle Bell, Lord Walder's mentally disabled grandson, as a hostage. She begs Lord Walder to take her instead and entreats Robb to escape the hall. Walder Frey refuses, and Roose Bolton steps forward and stabs Robb in the heart. Catelyn brutally murders Jingle Bell and then claws her face in grief and despair. One of the Freys grabs her hair, and the chapter ends with the thought, "Don't cut my hair, Ned loves my hair," as the dagger is drawn over her throat.
Whoa. Even hearing a summary is deeply affecting, I tell you.
It feels like, in my mind, when I imagine this scene, it feels like like an Italian giallo film. Like there's this weird emphasis this whole chapter on flesh in the combination of food and sex and eventually bloodletting that is really stomach churning to me. Like just the fact that people are fighting with hams of meat, hocks of meat at the end, trying to fight off their attackers, and there's people being bedded off screen, is that combination. It's really, like, I don't know, like this whole scene just feels sweaty and hot and like miserable in a really sensual way that I think really adds to just the unbelievable carnage and how disgusting it feels.
Like there's a bit of a decadence to it.
Right.
Well, I think that's highlighted in the fact that Frey enjoys it. You know, he just sits there. He like clearly
And more
is...
than that, gets off on it, right?
Yeah, no, this is his feast. I mean,
it's a consummation completely.
Yeah.
And there is a carnality to it and a sexuality to it. It was interesting to me the way they did it on the show. Like you could almost have imagined a far more daring intercutting of the bedding of sex with this, and the sex and the horror put side by side graphically. But maybe that was too much even for HBO.
So I saw a play in 2009 called Women Beware Women. It was an adaptation.
I saw that too. Oh
You
my
did?
God. Yes, I did.
Oh, well, okay.
Katie and I figured out like a couple years ago that we were both in London at the same time and saw like a bunch of the same plays.
So in this play, it was a modern adaptation of this Jacobin tragedy where all these characters are plotting against each other. And the staging was this giant house with the walls cut out so that you could see into all the rooms. And as the scenes would change to different rooms of the house itself would turn on this turntable up on the stage. And at the end, when all these characters gather for a dinner and start to sneak off one by one to kill each other, the house would slowly start to turn until it went faster and faster and faster, and all you saw was all these rooms with all these people murdering each other. And the whole time I was watching that, I was like, this is what the Red Wedding would be like in my mind, because when it finally slams to a halt, there's just bodies everywhere littered around this stage. But that is what, in my mind, like when we're reading the Red Wedding, it's like this carousel where no matter where Caitlin looks, there's just something even more horrible going on each time. It's just inescapable and it doesn't stop, and you want to get off the ride, but you can't.
Well, I think, I mean, to me, my thought, like, kind of after reading this chapter again, was, one, I had forgotten that Catelyn gets shot in the back, and we have kind of no real indication of how bad that injury was, or if that was intentional, or somebody went off script, or we don't know, which I just find interesting, because it's interesting for me to think what the phrase had intended to do with Catelyn exactly. But
oh my goodness, I never thought that was anything but intentional.
I know, I don't know, because
they don't. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? Maybe the phrase,
because they don't go for her, like they could. She's right by what's his name, Frey, you know, in his full armor, and he could have.
But is that because she's a woman,
too, or whatever?
Is that because she's not seen as a high value target for that reason? Go for the men first.
I think definitely.
What purpose would it serve if they chose to let Catelyn live? What value would she have as a hostage? I mean, they obviously plan to keep Edmure as a hostage, right? And he's the Lord of Riverrun. They plan to kill Robb Stark, who's the king in the north, and his brothers are already dead. So,
well, I think it's just Sansa, right?
Exactly. So what value does Catelyn have now as a hostage if there's nobody left to, you know?
Well, because you could use her against Sansa and Sansa against her if you wanted to get them to do something. Just, I don't know.
I think you could also
or something.
You could also use her. You know, they plan on killing Edmure as soon as Rosalind pops out a boy. So you know, they could have a backup hostage, and maybe one that would have more sway over the Blackfish. You know, because he clearly doesn't give a shit about Edmure.
Yeah, and isn't that a great plan though? Like, it's still going to be a Tully, and you're going to tell this kid like your family history, and like, we killed your father because we hated him. Like, oh my gosh.
No, we killed your father because once you were born, we could kill him as we planned all along.
Yeah, because you're one of us. You're one of us.
It's really I feel really bad for Edmure in this chapter.
Same.
I feel
Same.
Yeah, because he's absolutely clueless, and it's not his fault. But like he's off screen having sex while his sister and his nephew are being butchered, and it's like mentally, I don't think he would ever fully recover from that.
The survivor guilt must be extreme
I feel
Surely.
even worse for
Yeah.
the whole bedding scene. Is this the first time we see a bedding in the series?
Yes,
Because
I think so.
Sansa is an aborted bedding. She doesn't have to go through with it. But it just strikes me how, like, if you're in the right family and everyone's happy to be there and you're attracted to the person you're with, it's going to be a lot of fun, I guess. But if neither party is interested in this arranged marriage and you don't want to have sex with this person, but you're going to have to, it's like a prelude to a rape, basically, with your clothes being torn off, you're being pawed at, you're being teased and taunted and pushed towards this consummation that one or both parties doesn't want. And like, I actually felt the terror of those characters, especially Rosalind. She's crying presumably because she knows what's about to happen to these people, but on some level, like, it mixes in with the dread of this scene that, like, she doesn't want to do this on any level. She doesn't want to she doesn't want what's about to happen. She probably doesn't want to have sex with Edmure because she knows what's about to happen to his family, and it feels carnal and like a violation in the making.
Bedding seemed like a violation anyway. Like, even when Catelyn is thinking of her own bedding, characters that we think of in a very positive way, like Jory Castle or I don't know, William Dustin, even they're like tearing off her clothes, talking about her breasts, which is just so, I don't know, creepy. It's not a beddings is supposed to be like this happy thing, but they're not. They're just creep me out.
What
Well, because
absolutely kind of
marriages are not marriages are not a happy thing in this world. Like, it's all kind of a pantomime of how, you're supposed to feel, which I think is played really well in the contrast to Kat, because we think of her as having and she did have a happy marriage, but that, it's a very potent reminder that her bedding was also fucking terrifying, and she had thought it was one guy, and nope, he's dead. You have to marry his brother. You don't know him at all. He's not really talking to you. You don't know what the deal is. You're expected to have his son right away, which you proceed to do. I think that Catelyn's ability to look back on that with I don't know, with honesty is a very powerful choice on George's part, that she does not at all romanticize her own experience, and she's like, yep, I was scared too. And I had no idea what was going on. And that I guess maybe it's too bad, because her own fear kind of blinds her to the intensity of Rosalind's reaction, her memory of her fear, which I will say is maybe one point against Edmure, that, like, yo, your bride's crying. Like,
yeah,
maybe don't have sex with her right away. I don't know. But
yeah, the line, Caitlin does have a line where she's like, I hope he's gentle with her. And that alone is a very stomach churning thought of, this is going to happen, whether anybody has objections to it.
Of course, it's institutionalized rape, and if he doesn't do it, if he doesn't do it, he will also be judged. What I find even more amazing is, how on earth is Catelyn, as the new Lady Stark, meant to exert authority, be seen as a figure of respect in the North, when, all the people who are stewards to her husband have ripped off her dress and sort of, made lewd comments about her tits. The whole thing is just absurd as a ceremony. It just seems to be utterly counterproductive for these noble families to do this. And it really is. It's just institutionalized rape. It really is.
I think it's also, to get really like Freudian or whatever, it reminds me in a way of, I don't know what British holiday it was, where the servants would have a ball and, like, they would dance with their masters and whatever.
Yeah.
And
I feel like I should have remembered that from Downton Abbey.
I know, right? Fina, help us out here.
Traditionally at Christmas, I think, but I'm not sure how much that's just something we read of in books or whether it really happened.
Right. But it reminds me of that kind of, or like sort of a May Day ceremony where everything's upside down. And this is not obviously the small folk, and it is kind of friends and family, but it's still kind of like the people below you who are, certainly in Catelyn's case, able to expose you and not physically witness, I guess, but be present for, like, the most intimate moment of your life. And that seems to me kind of like I don't know, like a weird balancing ritual, like, we control you, but you got to, like, put us to bed for the first time. Like, you were in control of that in a weird way.
Huh, yeah.
Can we talk a little about the structure, or where this falls in the structure of Storm of Swords?
Yep.
Because I wasn't overly... The totality of the Red Wedding shocked me. I didn't expect everyone to get killed. I thought at best maybe Robb gets killed and Caitlyn gets taken as a hostage. But the fact that this actually happened wasn't that surprising to me, just from where it falls in the structure of the novel. because we're about 2/3 of the way through, and there's this very strange vacuum that happens in the plot of the story of this book in particular in relation to the previous two. Because in the previous two, what propels us towards Ned's execution, or rather arrest and eventual execution 2/3 of the way through the story, is that he's trying to solve this murder mystery, and the mystery tugs us through the plot. And in Clash of Kings, what's propelling us is
Katie,
this.
you've been listening to someone
That's a
else's
different.
podcast.
That's a
I
different
know.
podcast. That's not us. How dare you?
But in Clash of Kings, the thing that's propelling us is this build-up in the preparation to Blackwater through most of the novel until the eventual battle, which also takes place about a little more than 2/3 of the way through. And in A Storm of Swords, there's nothing that's really being built. There's nothing ominous that's being built up towards. There's a lot of politicking on all sides. There's this issue with the phrase that it feels like a snag in the plan. It doesn't feel like as portentous and as doomsayed as Blackwater was. And so when we finally get to the twins about 2/3 of the way through, in my mind, I'm like, okay, we've reached the midpoint of the story. Something has to happen. There has to be an implosion here. Otherwise, the structure of this whole novel just doesn't make much sense. And so I knew on some level that this was all building to something catastrophic, specifically just because it had not been alluded to in a way that was obvious, the way Blackwater or Ned's entanglement in the murder mystery of the first novel. It felt like George was hiding his hand, and because of that, I knew whatever was going to happen was going to be stupendous. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I
feel
admire
like
your
he
ability to
was.
think that way. I'm just reading.
Yeah, it's a flaw in my mind because I often get distracted, I think, thinking about structurally where these tension points in stories have to fall. So, if it's done well, it can surprise me. But a lot of the times I'm like, okay, this is the part of the episode where the murderer has to be revealed, because the previous, stuff like that, I get snagged up on a lot.
So do you feel Storm of Swords suffered for not having the obvious, the Blackwater to build up to? And do you think that the third of the book after the Red Wedding is an anti-climax? There's a lot. It's a bit like Lord of the Rings. You destroy the ring, and then there's still like another third of the book to go.
Oh, I think it's
Is there still something? Is there something strange in A Storm of Swords because of the structure and off-putting?
I don't know if strange is the right word. I think the first 2/3 of the novel, I remember getting antsy just because I wasn't sure what things were building towards. But after the Red Wedding, like, it is just climax after climax after climax of people's storylines reaching basically the end of their first act. And so, I mean, if we're taking there to be given that there's 7 books in the series and Feast Dance is kind of Act 2, people have to cross over their first threshold at the end of this novel. And so everyone's storylines kind of come to a culmination. And it's awesome. Like, it feels awesome that everything that has been built up towards since the beginning of Game of Thrones kind of comes to the head right after the Red Wedding again and again and again. It does make the next 2 novels a little more tedious because everything has to reassemble itself into new story arcs, new tension points, new climaxes.
I completely agree with that. And I think that to a certain extent, a lot of the letdown that people felt with Feast and Dance was unavoidable because this is a cataclysmic event and it does leave a sort of barren wasteland of no rules, and everyone has to rebuild, restructure, and we won't be able to tell truly how good or bad they were as novels until we see the final overarching architecture of this series. But if indeed we get there, and that's tough.
Did you want me to tell my story, Michal?
Do it.
I really would like you to. I think it's a great story.
I think everyone has a Red Wedding story. And Bina, you said that you put the book away because you were traumatized by it and needed an emotional sabbatical. My story was that I was in college when I first read these books and was deeply, deeply involved, falling in love with them like I hadn't been as invested in a book series in, a long, long time. And I was reading Storm of Swords when I was going through job training with my university, which I worked with at the time. And it was this all day, all weekend long, really tedious job orientation. Like, halfway through the year, we had to go through retraining. And basically, it was like we'd get up and do presentations and then sit down for an hour or 2 hours, and other people would do presentations. And so there was a lot of downtime to do reading. And when it got to this point with Arya almost making it to the twins and the Red Wedding, I was sweating. I felt sick to my stomach. I was having heart palpitations and fidgeting, and my neighbor, who was my coworker, kept looking over. She's like, Katie, what the fuck is wrong with you? And I was like, I can't talk. Like, I can't breathe. And so my stomach really started to hurt. And as I got to the end of the Red Wedding, I was hit by the most violent diarrhea I have ever had in my life. Rocketed up from the table, ran to the bathroom, and like was sick in there for about an hour or two. Came back to the table, read the Arya chapter where she gets hit in the back of the head with the axe, got diarrhea again, ran to the bathroom,
Oh my
was gone for
God.
about another hour. And I came back and was pale and shaky, and my coworker was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "You don't understand. He killed a little girl. He killed a little girl." Like, completely beside myself. And everyone was just like, "What the fuck is going on with
Bless
Katie?"
you. You took all my emotional stress and just made it physical.
I
Physical
have
manifestation.
a very delicate constitution, but that is only one of 2 times where a book has made me violently physically ill. Probably this one was probably worse than the other one. So yeah, that is my Red Wedding story. Is that George R. R. Martin gave me bowel bowel paroxysms and general intestinal.
Oh my gosh.
It's my favorite story.
The stress of reading. This is why don't read. Just don't read.
So
You have
Adam,
television,
Adam, what
you
was
have
your Red
movies,
Wedding story you
don't
now have
read.
to share?
Oh, mine wasn't nearly as bad. So I started reading like after the first episode of the show aired, and so I got to the Red Wedding a little bit after season 1. And I think I'd heard the term online, but I didn't really know what it was. And yeah, there was kind of that ominous feeling as I just plowed through it all kind of in one afternoon. And I was like, something's going on, and I did not expect everyone to die. And I think I finished the book probably within like 2 days after that. I just like plowed right through the book.
Okay, that's like the feast dance of stories. After Katie's, it's just a little bit of a letdown.
Yeah, the only thing that happened to me is the second time I did a proper reread, which was in 2010. I did it on audiobook. And for some reason, my family was getting new cell phones. So it was like a Saturday night. And we went to the store and I was listening to it because it takes a really long time. And I started crying in the middle of like the AT&T store. And I remember that's one of my brothers, who is like now kind of my main real life fellow fan. One of his first memories of the series is me crying listening to this part. It's not as exciting as Katie's, but it does I do remember that.
It's definitely, I mean, the first time is obviously shocking, but I think on reread it becomes unbearably painful. Just Catelyn has lost everything, and it's like watching the immolation of a person's spirit within a few pages. It's like she's done, she's gone, she doesn't want to live in this world anymore. And that final line of "he loves my hair," that was I was not expecting to feel that like a gut punch this time around, and it really struck me. I really love Catelyn's chapters in Clash of Kings and Game of Thrones. I think the River Run stuff can be a little tedious, but you get that this is a person who's just been crushed and feels like all power has been divested from her. And she goes on. It does get a little repetitive, like, "Oh, I've become a sour woman," but she really has nothing else to do except weigh on everything that has been taken from her. And here it is taken for the last vestiges of her family are ripped from her in the worst way possible. It's almost like a joyous descent into insanity at the end, where it's like, this is the world I live in. Okay, fine. All my family is dead. All my children are dead. I guess I can let go now and just scream and lose myself in it. Like, there's something that's maybe joyous isn't the right word. It's just like this, I don't even know how to put it right, but knowing like what becomes of her, it's just immolation. It's like the only word for it. It's like somebody burning up from the inside to become a husk.
Yeah, I think I've got to run because the draft is starting, so I hate to bail. But I want to say one thing before I go. When we did the FCR for this, right, and it was kind of silly recording, and I had to do all the cat lines. It was a little silly. Even still with that, the chapter comes through. It's very powerful. It's very affecting. At the end of it, I don't know how many times I've gone through this chapter, and I still kind of am like, oh, that was rough. And I feel like maybe it shouldn't be after your 10th time through, but I just think that speaks to the quality of the narrative that George has crafted.
The best thing that came out of the Red Wedding was us being able to gloat and watch the show watchers go through it. watching all those reaction videos after the episode aired. That was some good shit. That was some good hookah. I loved it.
Because it was like every room was like someone knew it was coming and someone didn't, and so like the person that did was recording and just laughing.
So that just means we're as sadistic as George, basically.
Yeah, that explains a lot. That really explains a lot.
Cool.
I don't know. I found it very hard to watch. Like, I remember I was shaking for a good while after watching Red Wedding. I think they did a good job with it.
It was very well done. Very well done. And then the next episode we actually see the head sewn on and pressing shit.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go draft football players because that'll make me feel better.
Bye, Adam.
Later.
So one thing I kept thinking kind of while I was reading this chapter is that I kind of feel like this should be a necessary prologue. You should have to reread this chapter anytime you read a Stoneheart chapter.
Yeah,
Does
because
that
it
make
gives it
sense?
context and it gives you empathy. Yeah.
Because it's so easy to forget like why she turns into this like horrific husk of a she's a monster. She's a literal monster, and it's very easy and understandable to be like I'm mad at her. I'm like, why are you mad at Brienne and blah blah blah, But Katie said she's broken in every possible way, and I kind of feel like she becomes the worst of what people have made of her. And I think that's important to keep it like, I really hate those people who are like, oh, this is her revenge for being mean to John. And I'm like, shut up and just cut it with your bullshit, because no.
See, that's interesting, Michal, because I have a very hard time seeing her as the same person as Caitlin and Stoneheart. I don't see them as the same person. Like, emotionally, I have a very hard time thinking of them that way. Not because it's the contrast is so different, but it's like, it feels like Caitlin dies here, and the thing that comes back is a facsimile, or like a reproduction of like an imprint of a person that used to exist. It's not really her. It's something that's pantomiming a person's place in the, if that makes any sense. Like I can't see them as a single entity, even though they both share the same body.
I agree. What do you think would happen if she came across one of her children, like if she came across Arya or Sansa? Do you think she has anything left for her own self to be able to recognize one of her own children? Because, according to Stoneheart, that's why she's taking revenge, right? Because she lost all her children. Do you think she has any recollection of what they actually look like?
I don't know. I mean, it's so hard because George deliberately, he transmorgifies everyone. Arya has that thought that nobody's gonna remember what she looks like, and whatever. But it happens to every single character. They all become contorted and unrecognizable to a certain extent, and it's hard to say because the kids have changed so much too, so would they recognize Cat? It's almost like they were puzzle pieces that once fit together and now have been melted, and neither piece can fit into the other anymore.
Yeah.
It's so sad.
I
can't do
that line from Catelyn where she says, I have lived too long and Ned is waiting. And only to have, and then she dies, which is, kind of a relief from all of her pain and suffering. But then she's brought back into this, I don't know, this horrible mutant version of herself that is just, I don't know, that's just extending her suffering. All she wanted to do at that point was die, and she didn't even get to do that.
But there's a good analogy there, isn't there, between Catelyn and Arya, that Catelyn finally has a chance of relief and to be with Ned in the afterlife, so to say, and is thrust back into this horrible world of traipsing around the Riverlands and this savage new version of Westeros where no rules apply. And the same happens to Arya. She has this chance to be reunited with her family, and then she's thrust back out again. They're both in a kind of purgatory. They're always traveling, but they never get to where they wish to go. It's like the Odyssey.
Yeah, and I think, I think very much George kind of, he pushes home the idea that the evil that is created comes from somewhere, and I think that is part of this story, that Catelyn, I mean, even if you want to look to Arya's story, even it starts because of Joffrey having Ned murdered, and that's the beginning of all of this, really. In this case, it continues with this unimaginable act of evil and cruelty and rule breaking and violation. It doesn't even stop once Catelyn's dead, not even in terms of Stoneheart, but they don't even bury them. They don't send them back to Riverrun. They're like, no, just toss in the river, like garbage. And that is what enables her resurrection. it comes back, I think, with Ramsay Bolton, with his being the product of rape, and like there's a big theme that like evil comes around, and I don't know. Like, it's very complicated because George's perception of justice and revenge are very complicated and very kind of like, I always say, like, he gives the best revenge to the characters that you're like, wait a second, that's not what I meant, like Theon. There's kind of a karma in the world that is sort of like everything is horribly unjust, but it's in balance in a certain way, because I guess maybe you would ask, like, what evil thing happened to Walder Frey to make him so evil, but I don't know. I think there's a mundanity in evil that is compounded into, an ultimate kind of horror, which is what we see here.
It's interesting that you bring up the fact that they throw the bodies away, or they desecrate the corpses, and it's not as if they could do anything else after the Red Wedding. I mean, if you think about when Tyrion came to King's Landing, he urged his sister, you need to send Ned Stark's bones back to his family. We need to extend this olive branch by showing respect to the dead. Even though we've executed him and the Starks will never forgive us, it is important that we honor, that we go through this ceremony, or at least make a show of going through the ceremony of respect for the dead. Like, you can't do that with the Red Wedding. You can't just straight lace up Robb and Catelyn's corpses and then send them back to River Run and like, oh yeah, sorry, we murdered these people at their wedding while they were unarmed and defenseless, but don't worry, we took care of the bodies and you can give them a proper burial now. Like, the ceremony and the respect is out the window at that point. There's no lawful justice in anything that was done here. Like, you could, Ned's execution, yeah, it was unjust, but it was done through, legal proceedings so that, there's at least an excuse there. There's no excuse for anything that happens at the Red Wedding. So it's not like, like Bina said, this is the most honest thing that happens in the books, and just trashing the corpses at the end feels like an extension of that honesty.
No, I agree with you, but I also think that in world, it is viewed as an extra. It's extra, it's viewed as something that the Freys did not have to do. And that, like, Tyrion doesn't even tell Sansa, he's like, he makes a specific note that he doesn't tell her what happened to their bodies. And I think that, all of this is orchestrated, obviously, by Tywin, and Tywin is, I honestly, I feel like he didn't give a shit, because he was like, oh, we won. If there had been a survivor who he felt that he had to parlay with at a certain point, even from a weaker position, I feel like he might have been like, and keep their bodies and don't mutilate them so that we can give them back and look like we give a shit for a second. It's a thematic hole with what the Freys do and the rule breaking and the honesty, as everybody said. But I think that it's still an extra level of awful that people are conscious of. And part of me was actually thinking like God, who had to clean this up? like that was we're having a party in my house tomorrow night, and like hopefully nobody's gonna die, and it's still gonna be a mess, so like I'm just thinking about like
the servants
and like, oh my goodness,
get the hoses
and like the fields outside, and oh my goodness,
what if it is,
go ahead, Nadia.
What if it is like obsessed with advancing his family, right? He wants to find positions. He has way too many children and grandchildren, and he wants to find positions for them. He wants to find better husbands for the girls. He, basically wants to glorify the Frey name in a way. Just the way that he chooses to do this by betraying guest right, it's like the Freys are considered like the lowest of the low now, right? After the Red Wedding, because they broke God's laws in the eyes of the Northmen, at least. And I absolutely love the line that Wyman Manderley says in Dance of Dragons. He says, when they're talking about one of the Freys that went missing, he says something along the lines of, he was so young, but it's a mercy because if he would have grown up to be a Frey. And I just think Walder Frey might have doomed his own family, even though he was trying to kind of do the opposite.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I have a question. Do we I don't think that Tywin Lannister gives a shit about armies or soldiers or civilians or peasants. He did unleash the bloody Mormors and Sandor Clegane on the Riverlands. He does make the argument, though, to Tyrion that isn't it better that these people die at a wedding feast rather than prolong this war for another year or two, and reading into that, like, stack up the bodies even more, stack up even more casualties.
So is this the same argument as Hiroshima?
No. I would never extend that because I wouldn't compare those two things. But I don't know, like there is something to be said, like we like Caitlyn and we like Robb and we're rooting for the Starks, but the thing that they are fighting for is vengeance for Ned and to succeed from the Seven Kingdoms. And that's basically it. They oppose the Lannisters because they hate the Lannisters. Not necessarily because the Lannisters the Lannisters do descend on the Riverland, but that was after events already started. Yeah, I don't know, like, there's part of me that's like, maybe it is better that these people be killed here rather than have the Riverlands suffer another year of battles and rapine. Not that the rapine.
The Riverlands don't stop suffering.
Don't they eventually? Doesn't this like create a petering off where eventually, because things are regrowing, like their commerce is returning in at least A Feast for Crows slowly, and things are still shitty. But I feel like
it Jaime in Feast for Crows, who's the one that does all the cleanup.
You mean going to like Maidenpool and Harrenhal?
Yeah, and just sort of, getting warring families of a more minor status to sort of put up or shut up. And
right.
I don't know. It feels to me like in a war of so many kings. If this was a sort of a war between two different factions, then yes, this would be potentially ethically considered to be the better option. But when there are so many factions, when this can't give you a definitive end, I think then it's more compromised as a choice.
I wouldn't compare it to Hiroshima just because I don't think in that situation.
No, that was appalling of me, and that was flippant. So I take that back.
That was not a necessary thing at all, and there was obviously an element of race involved and racist callousness involved in the decision.
But that was a typical justification used afterwards, right?
Sure, but I do think that what we see is that once the Starks are removed from the table, all the Stark lords that remain, they basically retreat to their holdfasts. They hole up either in Riverrun or it's Lord Bracken or the guy at Raventree. They kind of like they pull their men back, and there's sort of like all the monsters that the Lannisters and like the Bloody Mummers. It's suddenly like these people aren't needed anymore. We can take out the trash and get the harvest going again. It's a petering out, a very slow petering out, and the rapine obviously doesn't end because there's still monsters out in the field. But I do think that once Robb is removed from the chessboard, there is an end in sight to the hostilities in a way that there wasn't before.
I really disagree with that because I think that is very Taiwanist logic, and I disagree with that idea kind of ethically. But I think that you could maybe make the argument if it was just Robb and maybe his immediate circle of defenders. I mean, ignoring the fact that Robb was not even planning on staying in the Riverlands, he was turning tail and heading back north. Basically, I mean, leaving the Riverlords to kind of fend for themselves. But so he was withdrawing from that field of conflict anyway. And I think that, I think you could maybe justify killing Robb. I don't think you can justify the Red Wedding. I don't think that, wholesale slaughter in this society is, it's taboo for a reason. Like, they have guest right for a reason, because they want to stop this kind of thing. They don't think that somewhere along the line, people realize that they cannot have a functioning society if they don't have the concept of guest right. And the fact that the Freys and the Lannisters so blatantly disregard that, aside from the fact that, you're killing people who have no indication, no ability to defend themselves. You're deliberately getting them all drunk. You're rounding them up in packed feast tents and setting them on fire. I think that yes, these people are capable of fighting, but they are under a peace banner and have no idea what's coming for them. And I again, I can see maybe the argument for taking out the Nexus and the king, literally, and ending the war that way. But anyone else, I don't think so. And I think even, the glee with which the Freys take part in this, and their the fact that they are all complicit in, almost all except the ones who are consciously removed from the game. The fact that they're all on the table in some way, like Merritt Frey, it's like, I was just supposed to drink. I was just getting them drunk. And Kat has a line like, why did this guy start drinking with the Umbers? Like, he knew he wasn't going to hold his liquor, like, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, he did know that. I think, I don't know, I can't view this as a military strategy. I fundamentally have to view it as something personal, because Tywin is taking advantage of the personal. Like, if any of the rules had been followed, really, if anyone along this chain, if Bruce Bolton, if Tywin Lannister, if Walder Frey, if Robb, back when he married Jane, like, had followed the rules. I mean, the rules are bullshit, but if they had followed the rules, then this wouldn't have come to pass. So I kind of can't mentally play the game of saying that it's okay, even from a, like, cold tactical perspective, because I think that perspective from my point of view is flawed anyway.
This reminds me that when I was reading this chapter, I pretty much know this chapter by heart, probably. There was one thing I noticed that I hadn't noticed in previous reads, was that at one point, Catelyn is thinking that finally Robb is going to go battle with the with the Iron Men, and she's relieved, because she thinks, Robb wins all his battles, and at least he'll be away from all of this, all of the politics that he has to deal with, and the phrase and everything. And it's so sad that she kind of wants him to go back into battle, because she can see that he's not dealing with this very well. But eventually he doesn't get the chance to do it.
We've seen Robb's battles through her eyes so many times, and how excruciating that is for her, and the idea that is preferable to this, is I think really tells you a lot about Kat's state of mind and the state of the war in general.
Okay, is there anything more in this chapter, or should we move on to the next one?
Oh yeah, we still have one more chapter.
Small and yet equally traumatic. Okay, so after Cat 7 we move on to Arya 11, which is another comparatively short chapter. So Arya and Sansa are nearly at the gates of the Twins when they suddenly open, and a huge troop of Freys pours out. In what I thought was a particularly savage move, they knock down the big feast tents and set them alight. So you can only imagine what it must have been like for the drunk poor fools inside, being burnt to death. And they do that to the other tents as well. Then Sandor and Arya come under attack personally. Sandor gets on Stranger. 2 men come after him, and the others head for Arya. She throws a rock at Sandor, which is very bizarre. I mean, I don't know, we can get into this, but the concept that in that moment of attack, our first thought is to go after the Hound. Anyway, so Sandor then kills his attackers. We're going to later learn that one of them is Sir Tytos Frey, with an axe to the back of the head. And then Arya basically wants to rush into the castle to see her mum. The Hound, with his characteristic, factual, grim reality, says, look, your mother and your family are probably already dead. So she then turns tail and runs off, and he merely runs her down on his horse. And so far as we're concerned, he kills her by hitting her in the back of the head with his axe, except that 180 pages in my additional 13 chapters later, you realise that there's another Arya chapter, so she's not dead. But
Yep.
Back in the day, we didn't have tables of contents, and we didn't know. I just want to lay that on the line for people. Pre-internet, you didn't know that Paris had this deal with George that she couldn't die. So I thought, well, he's killed them all. This is how Arya dies, and it's ironic because she always wished for his death, and now he's killed her. So that's the end of the chapter.
Bina, are you saying that you didn't immediately flip forward through the pages to see if there was another Arya chapter?
I was thinking that.
No, because George had so killed my sense of any residual optimism, I just assumed she was dead. I didn't bother. I didn't think she was alive.
I was convinced for maybe, and then it was like, why would he do that? Like, the pieces didn't really fit together with what we've seen of his motivation, so that's what prompted me to, like, flip forward and be like, oh, thank God.
I mean, now I'm much more worldly wise, so
like
now if I don't see a death on screen in front of me, then I become incredibly skeptical, hence Quentin is alive, evidently. But in those days, I was but a sweet summer child, and the fact that she wasn't specifically, physically, viscerally, fleshily killed in front of me, I didn't see as a giveaway. I just thought they're all dead. Sansa's the only one alive, and she'll end up being killed by some Lannister. So, yeah.
Well,
How about you guys?
we
Did you think she was alive?
The thing is, George's
Well,
language
like,
is really tricky, because I think he actually he might even use the same language of, like, the axe, like an axe taking somebody in the back of the head, like that phrase, taking you. It's almost a cheat, because I feel like we would all translate that as killing her. I think we're supposed to, but I think that is what that means, really. And then later we learn, like, nah, he just whacked her with the flat. But I don't think that that's like a direct translation.
Actually, the thing that really stuck with me when I first read the chapter is what I pointed out in my recap is, I mean, yes, thinking Arya was dead was horrific, but I don't know, I'm more of a Sansa than an Arya person, so it wasn't maybe as harsh as it was for some other readers. It was this idea that these poor I mean, none of the soldiers are poor and innocent, right? They all indulge in rapine and pillage, but the idea that they would be burnt alive under these feast tents, that really stuck with me. Something about death. Oh, drunk, not knowing what's happening, smothered by fire. That seemed particularly cruel, but maybe that's just me.
No, it is. I mean, it's you know, you're not given any chance to defend yourself at all, you know, and I think that even the fact that, you know, the Freys who come out of the castle immediately turn on Sandor and Arya, and they don't know who they are. They look like peasants, you know, they look like people who have come to serve their food at the feast. They don't look like Starks. They're not wearing anybody's banner, badges, anything, you know, and they go right for them. I think such universal evil in this whole thing. Like, I feel like this is George saying, like, if you thought it was just evil inside the castle, don't worry, it's evil outside the castle too.
It also puts the Hound in context. As much as Arya thinks he's evil, and maybe we do for some of the stuff he does earlier on before we see his softer side with Sansa. I mean, when you're brutalized, you're born into this world that is so brutal, and he personally has been brutalized. It's hard to single him out for particular approbation, right? I mean, it's a savage place to live. And again, as you say, gives context to Lady Stoneheart. I mean, what is the alternative but when seeing this brutality, but to become insane, insanely violent in response?
But he is responsible for her more than anyone else really has been. Even he says he's doing it for gold, and I think that is true. But I also think if this was Bronn, he would have just left Arya, be like, okay, bye, I'm getting out of here. But he does seem to have, like, as much as he wants a reward for her, he also seems to have enough compassion and concern that he doesn't abandon her. He wants to protect her in some way, like he did Sansa.
Absolutely. And I think there's an analogy here between the Hound and Tyrion. I mean, both have their own agendas. But the Hound, when he advises her not to go into the castle, does so, I think, primarily because he cares that she doesn't get killed too. In the same way that Tyrion, when he marries Sansa, he's a Lannister and he has an agenda and he does want to sleep with her on the wedding night. But fundamentally, I think they're both basically decent human beings. And they don't deliberately want to cause pain and humiliation to these two Stark girls. And they're both figures that are physically disfigured, have been brutalized by their families, and are to some extent outcasts or sort of refuse or subvert Westerosi values. I think they're a very interesting pairing in that respect.
He is interesting. Yeah. He reminds me of like an abusive parent who was abused themselves, and now they think it's their duty to tough love their children into surviving in a harsh world. Like, that is the justification for mistreating their charges. And I think, like, if you look at the way he treats Sansa and the way he talks to Arya, he's being cruel to them, but he's also advising them, like, you need to smarten up and pay attention. And I can see in his mind, like, he'd be like, this is a shitty world that will chew you up and spit you out, and him trying to wake them up to that fact of, like, you know, be alert, stop dicking around, like, look what's going on around you.
I like the idea that Clegane is, he recognizes himself in each of the Stark sisters. Like, I think in Sansa he recognizes pre-burning Sandor, and in Arya he recognizes post-burning Sandor, and he tries to foster each side of himself in a slightly different way. I mean, it's obviously still very gruff and cruel and whatever, but he shows a vulnerability to Sansa that he doesn't to Arya, because I think he views Arya as on the way to becoming him already, whereas Sansa is like, you know, that child who is going to have her face shoved into a brazier, you know.
He's the best.
He is the best. It's so fascinating to me. Like, he's such an interesting character, and the fact that George pairs him with these two little girls is, I think, an amazing writing decision, and part of the reason why. Okay, here's my feminist side coming out, but I feel like a lot of the, like, badass characters who are men are, like, mostly appreciated by men. So, like, Bronn and Tormund, and, like, I know people who are women like them, but to me it's, like, mostly masculine traits.
Oh my god, the inexplicable fandom for Victarion fracking Greyjoy.
Yes, thank you. Oh my god.
Oh,
what the hell is that about?
Oh.
Yeah. No offense, Patrick, but We're just saying. I think that it's fascinating that Sandor Clegane is a popular character among people who identify with the very quote unquote feminine side of the show, of the show. Oh my goodness, wow, did I just slip? Of the books, of the series, however you want to interpret that, because it's such a strange combination, and he is one of the most vulnerable characters who we see, period. Like, I don't know if we see a non-POV character in quite the state, like quite the range that we see Sandor Clegane in terms of experiencing his fears, his pain, his trauma. I think it was really fascinating for George to contrast him with these two sisters, and for him to have that bond with them when everybody and their brother wants to be like, Arya and Sansa are nothing alike and they both hate each other in the end, you know? And then it's like, no, Sandor Clegane bonds with each of them. And everybody likes Sandor Clegane.
Yeah.
He's that heady combination of dangerous but sad. That can be very attractive.
He's a classic bad boy that every girl wants to fix and make better.
Yeah, I really view it as, especially with Sansa, like he really, like they each see something in each other that is familiar and also a warning. Like he is very drawn to her because that's who he used to be, you know, that enamored of knights and courtliness and honor, you know, and she starts to understand the ways in which he survives. I think it's actually a huge credit to Sansa that she never quite gets she doesn't quite take on his like disgusted view of the whole Westerosi charade. But Arya does. Arya has to.
Yeah. Anything else to say on this chapter, or all three, or the Red Wedding in general? Maybe we should take a moment just to discuss what the Red Wedding has done to fantasy literature, or to our expectations of it? Or do you think we've kind of already covered that?
I think it's done bad things to fantasy literature.
Why?
I think people take the wrong lesson from Ned getting executed, the Red Wedding. I think the show also took the wrong lessons in some ways from those two events, because I think George gets the unfair reputation as a butcher who anyone can die. And it's like, no, these people die in very deliberately constructed stories that culminate in an emotionally satisfying and thematically resonant way. It's not arbitrary, it's not random, it's not brutality for the sake of brutality. And I think that's what a lot of fantasy writers took from that, is like, well, if we can put any if any character is vulnerable and can be put on the chopping block, then that will draw readers and viewers in. But really all that does is teach people not to get invested in characters and not care about them. If anyone can die, then there's no reason to care. And that's not what George does. George puts very specific people in very specific situations and then offs them in a way that makes the story richer. And really, like, it's really just been like, these are the two big the two big deaths. I mean, lots of characters die in the story, but not to the extent that I think that he has gained the unfair reputation of, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think that George's acts like killing Ned in the Red Wedding, even if you want to like talk about it on a portentous micro level, like having Ned slaughter a puppy, within the first third of the first book, you know, I think that they do create an expectation, and I know I've heard of people who have stopped reading because they do actually get that idea that, like, if you are going to kill all these people, then I don't want to keep reading. So I think people have gotten that sense from the books as well. But I agree with you, Katie. I think that it comes back to me to a lot of like this idea that the books are realistic, you know, and I think people misinterpret what realism means. Like, yes, there is a certain element of realism that feels like the world is random and anything can happen to anyone at any time, but he's still an amazing storyteller. And you're right, like when you look back, the pieces, like, they fit together almost exquisitely, you know. And I mean, I think the rest of Storm of Swords is amazing too, and the Purple Wedding and its lead up and fallout are also incredible. But I think that I think that if you had to ask a lot of the fandom, like, this right here in the story is maybe the worst experience of reading it, but some of George's most incredible and transcendent work. And I agree that like we shouldn't just be like, oh well, it's grimdark and like random death and blah blah blah. It's orchestrated for a purpose, and we eventually feel that purpose. And I'm praying that we eventually feel that purpose for the events of Feast and Dance.
Yeah, it does bother me when people lump this series in with grimdark, even though I do understand why. But it doesn't feel, even though like brutality is everywhere in this story, it also feels in some ways like a very hopeful and romantic story in a way that I think underlies that.
Yeah.
Then again, I say hopeful because the last book is called A Dream for Spring, and that really just, tenderly strokes my heart in some ways. But it could just end in winter. We don't know.
Well, I keep thinking that like, George keeps saying that the end of the books are going to be bittersweet, and I keep thinking that we're going to finish and be like, that's not what bittersweet means, you asshole.
With Jaime and Brienne on the Isle of Tarth, holding hands as the blizzard descends upon them and freezes them in place.
Very Rogue One.
None of the stuff I ship is going to happen.
I know, me neither. You know what, Bina? Jaime does absolutely run off on Brienne's obvious lie. Like in his last chapter in Feast, and it's just like, or Dance, or whichever one it is. I've said this before on podcasts, but again, it's just like, oh, Sansa's in trouble? What? Yes, Jaime, come with me. Okay.
And he rejected Cersei's letter. She begged him to come back, and he threw it in the fire. All Brienne had to do was show up and be like, please come with me. And he's like, I'm there, babe. Let's go. Side saddle.
Yeah.
Boom.
Let's
out
do
the
this.
door.
Oh my god. Yeah. And he's riding behind her. I mean, it's hilarious when you read it like in that point of view, because there's not a single like second of objection or doubt in his mind, and it's gonna end horribly. And but we do have that moment of and this is with Brienne already even more horrifically scarred, because thanks George, than she was before.
Yeah. Oh.
That felt unnecessary.
Yeah. If I'm on that reread, I'm gonna rant about that chapter, because
we can make that happen.
Because I have issues with that.
We can make that happen.
Yeah.
You have issues with Brienne having to listen to Biter swallow pieces of her face while he's on top.
Yeah, a little bit. I kind of feel like it's a little extra, George. It's a little extra.
I feel like that a lot of the time with his sex scenes involving underage people.
Well, yeah. I do want to just say in his defense for a sec, because like in terms of the realism thing, like HBO and Game of Thrones have been like writing, I mean, I guess they've gotten better in some recent seasons, but like they and a lot of the fandom kind of think that like it's realistic is a defense for portraying rape and violent rape constantly, and it's not, and I think that George is actually a good example of that, because and not that he's perfect by any means in terms of his like sexual presentations or anything like that, but he doesn't depict characters getting raped. Like, it's going on in the background and it's awful, but he never, like, I think the most graphic thing we hear is Arya's witnessing of that story that Chiswick or whatever is telling over about the Inn girl. And of course, obviously, she goes apocalyptic and fucks up the entire series because she's so upset about that.
And
like,
evidently, when you're a talented writer or creator, there's a way of depicting exploitation that is not itself exploitative. And I think you're right that 90% of cases George is on the right side of that line, but ever so often he drifts into the other side, and it behooves us to call him out for that, I think.
He's really obsessed with Dany's nipples.
I know. It's so creepy. It's so creepy. So
everything like describes how like they touch her vest, and like when she wakes up and rises out of bed, they rise before her, and she's the only one that he does that with. Like, he doesn't describe Brienne's nipples or Caitlyn's nipples, I guess because in his mind they're uggos or something.
or Sansa,
yeah, but take for example another very
like
deeply sensual character, like, who's the woman that the Red Viper's boffing? He doesn't describe her in that kind of sensualized way, and yet she is a deeply sexually driven and powerful woman who is of legal age, right? So if you wanted to have a sort of age-appropriate description, that would have been it.
Yeah,
What
I
were
mean,
you
I
gonna
feel like
say?
occasionally you can accept it in terms of like Dany is coming to terms with her existence as a sexual person, but I agree it's definitely way over the top. I mean, it's that same kind of like trope that like, yeah, women definitely stare at themselves naked in the mirror all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
100%.
it's a regular it's why it takes us so long to get ready.
For sure.
Don't you take your top off and look at your tits and say boobs? And
No, but I have that scheduled in for later today.
Halloween is coming up.
Spooky boobs. Okay.
Should we just call this episode Spooky Boobs?
I feel like we have run out of stuff to say on the Red Wedding at this point. Does anyone have
I did
anything?
have something to say. I did have something to say
Oh,
about the
please
last
do,
Arya
Nadia. Please
chapter.
rescue us at this
It
point.
was just the music carrying on from the Red Wedding chapter to the Arya chapter. It's just the drum. All of the music stops, and at the end, there's just like this one drum going. And even outside, it's the same thing. The drums just keep going. They just keep pounding and pounding and pounding. And that's just, it sort of brings all of these chapters together, and it gives it almost like this horror feeling that George is really good at. I mean, it reminds me of The Houses of the Undying, which is also very creepy. And then this just, the drums in the background just sort of, I don't know, they make the chapter more alive for me for some reason.
I have a
It's-
question. Why does the music
ahead.
carry on once the musicians who are basically archers start shooting people?
To
That doesn't-
drown out the carnage. Yeah, I mean, the reason
Yeah.
they're being so loud is so that people can't hear the screaming.
Oh, but is
be
it
alerted
basically
that
just to keep
something-
the bedding, just to let the bedding continue and to drown it out? Is that why?
Yeah.
And to make sure, yeah, I mean, if people can hear the music from outside, even though it is louder than usual, I think people would maybe, like, even if they're just in the hall or out in the privy or across the way, might hear people, like, screaming and swords clashing. I would assume it's just a precaution, like, drown out the noise as much as possible so that the camps can't mobilize.
Yeah, and I think
Makes sense.
definitely. I mean, I think most of the music drops away. It's just the drums, right? That kind of continue, and then Castamere, which is, if you think about it, maybe a little more theatrical than necessary. But
It is a brilliant plan, though, because the logistics of making sure everybody attacks at the same time and making sure that nobody is alerted that something is amiss. Like, whoever decided, hey, we attack when we play this song in time with each other. Like, that is actually, I think, a really...
Yeah, it's a really good
Yeah.
plan, actually.
he's a good writer.
He is an immensely good writer, and it's just so impressive. His command of horror, his command of tension, the visceral nature of the violence we experience, the way he can prompt emotional and physical angst in us. Even, and I think it's
And
Adam
diarrhea.
that did it, and diarrhea. But even on repeated readings, that's what gets me. Like the first time, it's that awesome in the literal sense of the word shock. But on repeated readings, it still has that effect on me, and it just gives me so much admiration for him. This middle section of Storm of Swords, middle to sort of the 2/3 of the way through, is so tight.
Yeah.
It is mind-blowing how much happens after this, though, in terms of plot. We get the Viper versus the Mountain, the battle at the wall. Arya goes to Bravos, Sansa escapes and goes to the Eyrie. Peter murders Lysa, which is one of the best
Purple Wedding.
The Purple Wedding.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine how, when you think of all that plot in the last third of this book, after this immense act, why then the deceleration to Feast Dance must have been so shocking.
Mhm.
Because this is probably the most plot-rich 300 odd pages in the entire series. And then you just slow down, rebuild, recriminate, wend
Yeah.
your way around Essos for a few years, what feels like years.
Yeah, everyone is
Yeah.
in new locations too, which is, I think, really off-putting when you first launch into Feast Dance. Is like it doesn't like people are not where we expect them to be mentally. Tyrion's in Essos, Arya's in Bravos, Sansa is at the Eyrie, Jaime is back in King's Landing. And most of the people aren't stationary, or they've escaped the orbit of their usual roost that they've been in for
Yeah.
3 books.
And the pairings
they're
have
also
been
not who
split up,
they
haven't
are.
they? Like Brienne and Jaime. And I remember thinking Tyrion was going to be my anchor through Dance, but then he turns into this very unpleasant, bitter, potentially quite violent person. And it just feels like the Red Wedding happens, which is this great unmooring, unanchoring of the book. But you don't really fully grasp just how emotionally unstable the world is until you get into Feast Dance.
I didn't read most of Feast when it came out. I kind of like went through, like started it, didn't enjoy it, read kind of most of the Jaime chapters and then kind of and the Elaine chapters, and that was it. I couldn't
Yeah.
deal with it. The
That was me.
Ironborn. Oh, the Ironborn.
That was me and
Oh.
I have not, to this day, I have not read all of the chapters in Dance with Dragons.
No way.
I-
Which ones
I
do you
think
skip?
I skipped a John chapter because they got really samey halfway through the novel, and then I think I skipped the Cersei chapters at the end, where she does the walk. I think I might have read that one, and that was it. I don't know. Like I got really agitated towards the end of that novel. I was like, okay, let's wrap this up, please.
I haven't skipped any, but I have to say that there are parts of the book, such as this, that I've reread many times. But there are parts of Dance in particular that I have never reread since it originally came out. And I'm really partly kind of half not looking forward to doing the reread, but partly I think this reread series is going to sort of force me to go back to those and try and find some kind of meaning to them. But I guess I'm just a little bit worried that even this reread is going to be the wrong time to do that, because it's only when we have the next book, if we get the next book, that you'll truly see, because that's the culmination of the things that are building up in Feast Dance. Those are the big action set pieces and plot movements that justify all this like wandering around. But yeah, they're huge swathes. I mean, almost all of Dany I've never gone back and reread, which is saying something.
Yeah.
As someone who, so to say, apparently loves this series and devotes hours to podcasting about it, that's actually pretty poor in a sense, or speaks to
It's
how
not-
unengaged I was by it.
Yeah, not to turn this
Yeah,
into like.
Victorian's chapters, Arya Hota's chapters. I don't know. I don't remember any
Oh
of
god, I forgot about that too. Yeah, not to turn this into our inevitable bashing of Feast Dance, but it is, I think, very telling that like I can remember almost everything that happens in every Tyrion chapter in A Clash of Kings just by the first few paragraphs, and I could say that about all of the first 3 books, and that every chapter, even if characters are in the same place and they're kind of doing the same thing, each one is very unique in what's going on. You can't say that about all of Jon's chapters or all of Dany's chapters or all of Cersei's chapters, where it feels like we're treading water for 500 pages building up to something. Like after a certain point, it's like, okay, I don't fucking care about the food crisis at the Wall anymore, Jon. Like, for fuck's sakes, like get somewhere, do something.
Absolutely. And just as I said, you can write exploitation without being exploitative. You can write people being stuck in the molasses of poor governance and not knowing what to do and apparently intractable problems without yourself being, as a writer, in an intractable problem and stuck in molasses and not getting anywhere. And
Yeah.
that's where the Maronese not plus just a complete lack of good editing really harmed Feast Dance.
It does feel like a mistake that the 3 biggest plot lines in Feast Dance are 3 people not knowing what to do. It's Dany, Jon, and Cersei of like treading water and being stuck in a morass and not knowing how to go forward and being crowded on all sides. And it's like that could be thrilling, but it somehow just feels tedious.
It should be meaningful,
Yeah.
right? And I think if he had managed to get all that done in a half to 2/3 of the pages he actually used, and then had stuck on the Battle of Marine at the end of that book to give it an ending and some purpose and some resolution and closure, we would have all moved forward much more happily with those 2 books. But because he was so baggy and took so much time, he wasn't able to do that. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to bring the conversation to a close. I think the Red Wedding, with a combination of the Full Castle recording, this episode, and there's a forthcoming VOK being hosted and edited by Nymeria Mary on just looking at Robb, Robb as a non-POV chapter. What do we think of him now that he's dead, the choices he made, the troubles he faced? I think with these 3 episodes, we've pretty much exhausted everything that Vassals of Kingsgrave has to say about the Red Wedding. It's been an absolute pleasure to discuss it with you all again, especially Katie, that fantastic story. So I want to thank Adam, Michal, Katie, and Nadia for participating. Thank you guys. It's been really fun.
Thank you for hosting.
More than welcome.
And your fast editing. that I'm sure will
We'll
happen.
see.
Refresh this podcast feed. Oh, look, it's there.
Absolutely. If you want to follow along at home, if you're still bearing with us on the reread, the next episode, 51, is all going to be at the wall. So it's Sam 3, John 6, and John 7. In the meantime, if you want to see what else we're up to, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube by searching for Vassals of Kingsgrave. If you want to get involved, however, and chat to some of the other hosts and people who listen, search for A Podcast of Ice and Fire and you'll find our forums. And then finally, I guess I should just ask if anyone has any forthcoming episodes they'd like to advertise, pimp out, highlight.
I don't think so.
Harry Potter.
I'll put it up eventually. Oh my god. Those things are such a beast to edit. It's like, ugh.
Wait, you already put the last one out, didn't you?
Yeah, the last one's up. I haven't put up the first CTA for Prisoner. Yeah.
I've been sitting on a Glow episode that I haven't even started editing.
Oh yeah, that was a fun recording. Yeah.
Yeah, I still have to edit that.
Can't wait to listen to that. And then, of course, after tonight's big Twin Peaks finale, we'll be trying to get together the old but Castboys crew and do a Twin Peaks The Return sort of series over.
Yes. Very excited.
I'm very excited.
I may ping you after tonight's episode to talk to you, Lena. Not call you, but text you on Skype.
Please do. I'm going to be desperate to know what happened because I'm not going to be able to watch it till this time tomorrow, and surviving that whole day at work. I mean, I will spoil myself. I don't care, but I need to view that as soon as possible. Well, thank you very much, ladies. Have a great night and speak to you all soon.